Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're going to be looking at the Treaty of Versailles.
Oh, the Treaty of Versailles.
Yeah, it was signed in 1919, and it's considered a pretty big deal historically.
It is, yeah. Huge ramifications.
And we're not just going to be talking about what's in the treaty itself, but the long-term consequences, the ripple effects.
The why, not just the what. Exactly.
Right. Think of it as your crash course on this super complex event and how it impacted, well, everything.
Like a cheat sheet for understanding how we got to where we are today.
Totally. And let me tell you, it's full of little twists and turns. Did you know that the treaty basically forced Germany to say, yep, World War I, all our fault?
Yeah, the war guilt clause, Article 231. Talk about adding insult to injury.
Oh, and get this. The United States, they were super involved in making the treaty, right?
Huge players at the table.
But they never actually signed it.
Right.
Crazy, right?
Yeah, it's a fascinating story. The treaty really came out of this desperate need for peace. Think about Europe in 1919. Devastation. Millions dead. Cities in ruins.
Right, like the whole continent was just reeling from years of brutal war. It's almost hard to imagine.
It was a world in chaos, yearning for stability. And so you have the Paris Peace Conference, this massive gathering of 32 nations trying to figure out how to move forward, to make peace with the defeated powers, especially Germany.
32 nations, all with their own agendas, their own scars from the war. Talk about a recipe for some tense negotiations.
Absolutely. And at the center of it all, you have the big three. Woodrow Wilson of the USA, Georges Clemenceau of France, and David Lloyd George of Great Britain.
The power players, each with their own vision for the future.
Wilson, the American president, he was driven by this idealism. You know, his famous 14 points plan. It was all about peace, international cooperation, and his big idea, this thing called the League of Nations.
The League of Nations, like a global peacekeeping organization.
Right. Exactly. Designed to prevent future wars through diplomacy and collective security. A very noble idea. But his counterparts at the table, they had other priorities.
Like Clemenceau, right? He was the prime minister of France. And France had been hit really hard during the war.
Oh, yeah. They bore the brunt of it. And Clemenceau, he had this nickname, the Tiger. He was fierce, determined to punish Germany harshly, saw them as a direct threat.
Yeah, I mean, understandable, right? After all the devastation France had gone through.
His goal was basically to cripple Germany, to prevent them from ever waging war again. So he was pushing for tough measures, territorial losses, reparations, you name it.
Okay, so you've got Wilson with his idealism, Clemenceau wanting retribution.
Yeah.
What about Lloyd George, the British prime minister? Where did he stand?
Lloyd George. He was more pragmatic, I'd say. He wanted to punish Germany, sure, but not completely destroy them.
He was thinking about the bigger picture of the European economy and all that.
Yeah. Right. He had to balance, public opinion back home, which was definitely in favor of punishing Germany, but also the long-term stability of Europe. And that meant Germany couldn't be completely sidelined.
So three powerful figures, three very different perspectives, all trying to shape the future of Europe. What a powder keg.
Yeah, you could say that. Trying to reconcile those conflicting goals, well, that made for some incredibly tense and complex negotiations. The Treaty of Versailles that eventually emerged was, it was a product of compromise and power dynamics, let's be honest.
Okay, so enough about the backstory. Let's get down to the nitty-gritty. What did Germany actually have to agree to?
Well, one of the biggest blows was the loss of territory. Germany was forced to give up key regions, like Alsace-Lorraine, which went back to France.
Alsace-Lorraine? I mean, that was a historically contested area, right? Back and forth between France and Germany?
Oh, yeah, rich in resources and steeped in history. Giving it up was a major concession for Germany.
Must have been a bitter pill to swallow.
And it didn't stop there. The Saar Basin, another resource-rich region, particularly known for its coal production, was placed under the control of the League of Nations for 15 years, with France getting the rights to the coal.
So Germany not only lost territory, but a vital economic asset, too. Ouch. What else?
Then there was the Polish Corridor, a strip of land carved out of Germany to give Poland access to the sea. It separated East Prussia from the rest of the country.
Wait, so they just, drew a line through Germany?
Pretty much. And keep in mind, these weren't just lines on a map. These changes meant that millions of people suddenly found themselves living in different countries, which created a whole new set of problems.
Wow. Okay, so territorial losses, check. What about military restrictions?
Yeah.
I imagine Clemenceau pushed hard for those.
Oh, absolutely. The treaty drastically limited the size and power of Germany's military. The army was capped at a measly 100,000 men. That's a tiny fraction of what it was before the war.
Like they were practically disarmed.
Pretty much. No tanks, no aircraft, no submarines, all banned. And to further protect France, the Rhineland, which borders France, was demilitarized, creating a buffer zone.
Wow. So they were really determined to make sure Germany couldn't pose a threat anymore.
Determined is an understatement. And then there were the reparations, the financial penalties. Remember those? Clemenceau was adamant about making Germany pay for the war.
Yeah, the reparations. How much were they again?
A staggering sum, 6.6 billion pounds. To give you some perspective, that's over 300 billion pounds in today's money.
You're kidding. That's an insane amount of money.
And this was on top of their already weakened economy. It was a crushing burden.
It seems like they were piling it on.
And as if that wasn't enough, there was one more thing. Article 231, the infamous war guilt clause.
Ah, yes, the war guilt clause. The one that forced Germany to take the blame for the entire war, right?
Exactly. Germany was forced to accept full responsibility for starting World War I. It was a huge humiliation, a blow to their national pride.
I can't even imagine the resentment that must have caused.
Oh, it was immense, especially since, many Germans felt that the war's origins were a lot more complicated than that. That blaming them alone was just unfair.
So let me get this straight. We've got territorial losses, military restrictions, crippling reparations, and a public shaming in the form of the war guilt clause. All in one treaty. That's a lot to process.
It was a lot for Germany to process, too, and it had huge repercussions, as you can imagine. But wait, there's more. The treaty also established the League of Nations, remember?
Oh, right, the League of Nations. That was Woodrow Wilson's big idea, wasn't it? Like a global council to prevent future wars.
Exactly. It was meant to be a positive outcome, a way to foster international cooperation and prevent another global conflict. But there's a bit of a contradiction.
Let me guess. Germany wasn't invited to join?
Bingo. Even though the treaty was largely about Germany, they were initially excluded from the League of Nations. Talk about adding insult to injury, right?
Yeah, it seems kind of counterproductive. And what about the United States? They were all about the League of Nations, right?
They were the ones who championed it. But then they did something unexpected. They refused to join.
Hold on. They refused to join their own creation. Why would they do that?
Well, it was complicated. The U.S. Senate, they were worried about getting tangled up in foreign affairs, They don't want to be dragged into future conflicts because of the League, so they blocked it.
Wow. So the League of Nations, this great hope for peace, it was already facing some serious obstacles right out of the gate. I can't wait to hear how everyone reacted to this treaty and what the long-term consequences were. But I think that's a story for the next part of our deep dive. All right, so we've laid the groundwork here, talked about, all the back and forth that led to the Treaty of Versailles, but now let's get into the reactions.
Yeah.
How did people actually feel about this monumental document?
Oh, you can imagine, right? It was a mixed bag of emotions. Anger, humiliation, maybe a little bit of cautious hope, depending on, which side of the table you were on.
Yeah, that makes sense. So let's start with Germany. I mean, how did they take all of this?
Well, it probably won't surprise you, but the reaction in Germany was pretty much what you'd expect. Anger, a whole lot of humiliation and resentment. They saw this treaty as a diktat, basically a dictated peace forced upon them. No real negotiation, just, here, sign this.
Yeah, I bet. Especially with that war guilt clause hanging over their heads.
Oh, that was a major blow to their pride. They felt like they were being made the scapegoat for the whole war, which had very complicated origins. And then on top of that, the burden of those reparations.
Right, those massive payments. Didn't that end up causing some serious economic problems in Germany?
Absolutely. It was a huge financial burden. And combined with other economic woes, it triggered hyperinflation in the early 1920s. The German mark, their currency, became practically worthless. People's savings got wiped out. Poverty was widespread. It was chaos.
Wow, so the treaty basically threw Germany into economic turmoil.
It did. And all that economic chaos, combined with the deep resentment over the treaty, it created this breeding ground for extremist groups. Groups like the Nazi Party. They were able to exploit the public's anger, promising to overturn the treaty and make Germany great again.
Oh, wow. So
Yeah.
Are you saying that the treaty, in a way, helped Hitler come to power?
Well, it's a complex issue, but yeah, a lot of historians argue that the Treaty of Versailles, with all the resentment and instability it created, played a big role in paving the way for Hitler's rise.
That's a scary thought. A treaty meant to bring peace ends up contributing to the rise of one of history's most brutal dictators. Man. Okay, so what about France? How did they feel about the treaty?
France, well, they had suffered the most during the war, so they felt a sense of, I guess you could say, satisfaction seeing Germany held accountable. They were happy with the territorial gains, the reparations, and the fact that Germany's military was severely weakened.
Yeah, after all they went through, I can see why they want to make sure Germany couldn't hurt them again.
Right. But they weren't entirely satisfied either. There was this lingering fear, that Germany would eventually recover and try to get revenge. Some people thought the treaty wasn't harsh enough, that they needed to do more to keep Germany down for good.
So even in victory, there was still this undercurrent of fear, this anxiety about what the future might hold. Interesting. What about Great Britain? Where did they stand on all of this?
Lloyd George, the British Prime Minister, he had kind of mixed feelings about it. He understood why people wanted to punish Germany, but he was also worried about the long-term consequences of crippling their economy.
He was thinking about the ripple effects, right? How a weak Germany could hurt the whole European economy.
Exactly. Britain had a lot of economic ties to Germany, so he was afraid that if Germany collapsed, it would drag everyone down with them.
Makes sense. He was walking a tightrope, trying to balance punishment with pragmatism. Okay, and lastly, let's talk about the United States again. They were so involved in drafting the treaty, but then they just bailed.
Yep. President Wilson really pushed for the League of Nations, this whole idea of collective security to prevent future wars. But the U.S. Senate, they weren't so keen on the idea.
They were worried about getting pulled into other countries' conflicts.
Why exactly. So they refused to ratify the treaty. The U.S., after all that work to create a lasting peace, ended up stepping back from the world stage.
Wow. So the treaty, even though the U.S. didn't sign it, ended up having a huge impact on their foreign policy. It's like their approach to global affairs changed overnight.
Pretty much. The U.S. took a step back from international involvement, and that had big implications for the future of, well, everything. The Treaty of Versailles, even in its absence, shaped the course of the 20th century. It's fascinating, isn't it?
It is, and it's kind of disturbing, too. I mean, the treaty was supposed to create peace, but it seems like it just created a whole new set of problems.
Yeah, it's a reminder that things don't always go as planned, even when you have the best intentions. The treaty was meant to prevent another war, but in a way, it might have actually helped set the stage for World War II.
All right, so we've talked about how everyone reacted to the treaty, all the anger and resentment and uncertainty. But now I want to get into the long-term consequences. Like, how did this document end up shaping the world we live in today? That's the really big question, right?
Absolutely. The Treaty of Versailles didn't just impact Germany or Europe. It had ripple effects that were felt across the globe. And those effects, well, some of them are still being felt today. It's a story of unintended consequences, of the fragility of peace, and the challenges of building a better world after a devastating war.
It really makes you think, like all these decisions, all this effort to create peace, and it might have actually made things worse in the long run.
Yeah, it's the law of unintended consequences, I guess. History is full of them.
Totally. So we've covered a lot of ground here. Talked about Germany, the new map of Europe, the League of Nations, even how the U.S. reacted. But if we had to boil it all down, what's the big takeaway for our listeners? What do we want them to walk away with?
I think the biggest thing to remember is that history is complicated, messy. The Treaty of Versailles, it was meant to create peace, but it ended up contributing to more conflict. Like, it's a classic example of how even with the best intentions, things can go wrong. Really wrong.
It's like, yeah, you want to hold people accountable, but sometimes punishment just creates more problems. And if you don't deal with the underlying issues, like those ethnic tensions we talked about, it's just don't blow up later.
Exactly. The people who wrote the treaty, they were so focused on punishing Germany and redrawing borders that they kind of missed the bigger picture, didn't think about the long-term consequences.
Like they say, the road to hell is paved with, you know the rest.
Good intentions. Yeah, we've all heard that one, but it's true. And I think beyond the specific consequences of the treaty, it shows us how fragile peace really is, how hard it is to build a lasting peace when everyone's still dealing with the trauma of war and looking out for their own interests.
It's like peace isn't just about ending a war. It's about, well, it's about constantly working at it, understanding each other, addressing the root cause of the conflict.
Right. And that's where the Treaty of Versailles fell short. It didn't really address those deeper issues.
So what can we learn from all of this? I mean, the treaty was signed almost 100 years ago, but it still feels relevant today,
Oh, absolutely. I think it's a reminder to learn from the past. Not just study it, but actually learn from the mistakes that were made. Because if we can understand what went wrong, maybe we can avoid repeating those mistakes in the future.
Yeah, like how do we create a peace that actually lasts? How do we build a world where something like World War II never happens again?
Tough questions, but they're important ones to ask. And maybe, by looking back at the Treaty of Versailles and all its complexities, we can start to find some answers. Or at least we can avoid making the same mistakes.
Well said. So, the Treaty of Versailles, it was flawed, it had some serious unintended consequences, but it's still a major turning point in history. It's a story about the challenges of peacemaking, about the need to think long term, and about how even the best intentions can sometimes lead to disaster.
Yeah. It's a story that, unfortunately, is still relevant today. We still see conflicts erupting, treaties being broken, and the struggle for peace continues.
It makes you wonder, what if things had been different back then? What if they had focused more on rebuilding and reconciliation instead of punishment?
The what ifs of history. Always fascinating to think about. Could a more conciliatory approach have prevented the rise of Hitler and led to a more peaceful Europe? We'll never know for sure.
That's the thing about history, isn't it? It's full of possibilities, different paths that could have been taken, but we can only learn from what actually happened and try to make better choices in the present.
Exactly. And I think that's a great note to end on. The Treaty of Versailles, it's a reminder that history is full of twists and turns, and that even our best efforts to create a better world can have unexpected outcomes. But by studying the past, by understanding the choices that were made and the consequences that followed, we can hopefully learn to navigate the complexities of the present and build a future where peace is more than just a dream.
Well said. And on that note, thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the Treaty of Versailles. We'll see you next time for another journey through history.